Should I?
All right. Good morning, everybody. Welcome to Comm Week Day 2. We're glad you're here. I hope you've enjoyed breakfast and gotten some of your swag. This is the second day of our Comm Week event. We do have a hybrid format going on. It's great to see a lot of people here in the house with us today, and we've got a group of folks joining us live online as well. So really glad you're here. Yesterday was a good kickoff. I think today's going to be another excellent day of information and fun. And there's breakfast back there. Help yourself if you haven't gotten any yet. And come back at 12:30 for lunch. So free food, if nothing else. My name is Eric Wilson. I'm one of the faculty members here at the Elliott School of Communication. And I have the great honor of introducing our speaker this morning. This is Bryan Steele. Bryan is the founder of Forge Podcast Company. And Forge is a business that Bryan has built to offer turnkey podcasting solutions that allow individuals or business owners to develop high-quality professional podcasts, beginning with content strategy, moving on to production, and all the way through marketing and distribution. And Bryan really has strived to remove barriers, hangups, and distractions that are keeping clients from being able to reach their audience in a meaningful way. And he's going to talk about how he's built that business and the storytelling strategies and things that he's used this morning. So that's the technical side of Bryan, but you're all probably wondering why the writing and person who had to ask a student how to silence his Apple Watch yesterday is up here talking about this high-tech thing. Well, I've actually known Bryan on the personal side for almost 20 years now. So since most of y'all were in diapers, if even that. So Bryan and I met through a campus group here at Wichita State. I came here in 2002, so probably shortly thereafter, and have kept up with Bryan for a long time through that. In college, Bryan was a huge Shocker basketball fan, still a season ticket holder, dressed up for the games. Maybe you can ask him a question more about his costume later, but traveled to the postseason, still a diehard dedicated Shocker basketball fan. He is an excellent guitar player. He's on our worship team at church and absolutely shreds it when he gets up there. He's also a proud husband and dad. We were talking and getting ready for this about how our lives have changed over the last 20 years, but they're definitely more interesting now. So with that, I'll get out of the way and introduce Bryan. Bryan, thanks for being here.
Thank you, Eric.
Appreciate it. So thanks everybody for being here. This is actually really awkward for me because I'm normally the one sitting behind the computer, behind the mic, so I'm not normally the one talking in front of everyone, but I'm excited to share with you
kind of what I've learned about podcasting. You can feel free to ask me how I fell into it backwards years ago, but it actually ties back into my Wichita State basketball following. So today I just want to talk a little bit about what makes podcasting suck and how to make it suck less. So that is the main goal today. I know the theme was how podcasting is part of the media that made us. Podcasting is still relatively new, but I thought it was probably good to point to this. I don't know, do I click the next slide to pull up the clip, or are you going to take care of that for me?
You can play it there, and we've got it on the screen. So are you
okay, so just hit it. All right, here we go.
Well, I just want to take a minute to talk to you all about something very serious. Once every hour, someone is involved in an internet scam. That man is Michael Scott. He's supporting about 20 Nigerian princesses.
Hey, you know what? Forgive me for caring, right?
Well, Michael is a great delegator. He never does any work himself, ever. And one time I walked in on him naked, and his thing is so small.
Whoa. How small is it?
If it were an iPod, it would be a shuffle.
So the iPod came out in October of 2001, and with it, new opportunities to listen to your music wherever you went. It was this new technology. It was super great when I was in college because you could, everybody wanted to get one. It was a hot gift, and obviously pop culture references to it abound from The Office. But it allowed people to create new audio to listen in a talk format. So podcasting was born. That's where really the root word came from. There were some other formats of doing that before, but there were still some barriers. Some people were doing that, but you had to download it on your computer and then put it onto the device. There were some things that made it really difficult early on. But then something changed. The iPhone showed up. When the iPhone showed up, you could get your music on demand. You could get podcasts on demand. So automatically you could subscribe to something. You could find some audio storyteller that you really enjoyed, some format you really liked, some host you really enjoyed, and you could subscribe to it and it would automatically download to your phone. It would tell you when something new had arrived. You could listen to it. And ever since the iPhone appeared, podcasts have been on the rise. So just some statistics that go back to 2020. Every year, the number of people listening to podcasts goes up by 20%. That's the number of regular listeners. The number of people in the United States, so adults, and I think it's adult population, or 12 plus, 55% of the United States population has listened to a podcast, and 37% of the US population listens to a podcast regularly, will regularly consume the podcast. And like I mentioned, that number is continuing to tick up at about a 20% per year increase. So certainly it's continuing to rise. So that's what's really got a lot of people interested in podcasts. Apple, Spotify are continuing to invest a ton of money into the media. They're buying production companies. They're paying for, the top tier hosts to try and get it because it's an opportunity for them to generate advertising revenue, which is what a lot of it is based on. But what's interesting about podcasts is they talk about we've just crossed recently, the estimates are somewhere between 1 million and 2 million total podcasts, which is a lot. But what a lot of people think about is that this is a huge number of podcasts. It's already saturated. But what I'm often telling individuals or businesses, I'm like, no, this is still the blue ocean. When you compare it to the number of online blogs, when you compare it to the number of Facebook business pages, Instagram business profiles, YouTube channels, podcasts is a tiny sliver right now. So there's lots of opportunities still in podcasts to try and find your niche, your audience. It's a little bit of a different when you compare it to, say, social media strategies. When you put out something on social media, you're expecting, hundreds, thousands of likes. When you start a podcast, I always tell people it's much smaller. It's always going to start as much smaller numbers, but your level of engagement is much higher because instead of somebody just scrolling by and seeing something for 3 seconds and liking it and moving on, you're actually engaging them for 20, 30 minutes, sometimes as much as an hour. So you're really generating that trust level with the listener. So even though the audience size is smaller, you're really getting a lot of engagement, a lot of buy-in, a lot of connection with whoever's listening. So that's some of the little bit of the background around why podcasts are so attractive, why people are getting into them so regularly, and why I encourage it, why I've really enjoyed it. And I probably listen to like 5 or 6 shows regularly. But what's interesting about that number, so I said 1 million to 2 million podcasts out there right now, roughly 75% of those shows are no longer active. They're no longer in active production. So you're looking at between 200 to 500,000 podcasts right now that are actively running. So even that tiny slice, even much smaller. But it begs the question, what's going on that's causing this to happen? It's actually coined its own term for someone who starts a podcast and then stops. It's called pod fade, which is a hilarious term to me. But what people get into is they don't understand what they're going to do or what their goals are. They don't necessarily see the success with their podcast. They're not growing. Maybe they have the wrong expectations, or they jump in a little quickly without understanding what their voice is going to be, what their goals are. So, we have to ensure that what we're doing with our podcast doesn't suck. We have to go into it prepared. We have to make sure that we're organized throughout the process. So this is something that I work with the 4 podcasts I'm actively producing right now. And I've talked to a lot of people about their podcasts as they're trying to plan it. So I'm going to break down the areas where people get tripped up into 3 primary phases. And if you focus on these 3 phases and these specific areas, you're going to have a lot more success. The first is in the preparation. This is where a lot of people just skip right over. They go straight into recording. They're like, I got an idea. I can use my phone. I'm going to record a podcast now, and I'm just going to get started. And that is the quickest way to fall off the wagon down the road because you're not at all prepared for the long term. The second is production. There's always some challenges that you run into when you're producing your episodes, and I'm going to give you some tips on how to do that. I could talk for hours about production and some of those details, but those are not as difficult to work through as some of the specific hangups that you will get into with production. So I'm specifically going to talk about those challenges. And then finally, the promotion. This is something that I think a lot of people skip. They just kind of get started and put it out there without thinking about how they're going to promote it, how they're going to go find their audience. So first, I want to talk about the value of preparation. So it doesn't have to be long. It may be a week of really thinking about it. It may be 2 weeks. It may be a month, maybe 6 months. I know in some of the cases I've talked with people for 3-4 months before we ever even start recording on a microphone to get them fully prepared for what they're going to get into with the podcast. So it's important to take your time. The first thing you have to ask yourself, and you have to go more than the 5-minute answer, is why you're going to start a podcast. And it can be for completely narcissistic reasons. That's totally okay. There's nothing wrong with that. But you have to understand why you're going to do it, because if you don't do that initially, you're not going to give yourself the right set of goals. You're not going to have the right set of expectations. So what are you trying to draw clients to leads to a new business? Are you wanting to just entertain people? What is it you're wanting to do? Are you wanting to make this a business? Maybe you want to use this as a way to talk to experts in an industry you're really interested in. Maybe you want a job in it one day. It's like, well, if I start a podcast and I interview all these people and get them on my podcast, I'll learn and I'll start building a network. That can be totally legitimate reason. You may not be able to sell a lot of advertising dollars for that, but it can be super valuable. So there's lots of different reasons why someone will want to start a podcast. But then you have to think about why someone will listen to your podcast. What is it that's going to bring them back again and again and again? And you have to really think long term. And some people will start with, with the demographics. They'll go, okay, well, who am I going to reach? You can do the very general. They're going to be a mid-30s, white, male, non-Hispanic. They're going to have a college education. They're going to make roughly this amount of money. That's the numbers that marketing will tell you. Hey, if you're advertising to these people, this is how you're going to charge. This is who you're reaching. But that doesn't tell you what kind of a podcast you need to make. That's not going to help you do anything. But if you're going to talk to Jim, and you go, well, he's in a dead-end sales job, and he's hopelessly in love, and he wants to get out of his current situation, but he doesn't know how. He's totally bored at work all the time, so much so that he's constantly playing pranks on his coworkers. Now I'm starting to get somewhere where I'm like, how am I going to engage him? They call this an avatar. I'm sure you're familiar with that concept. But the more you start to think about the person you're going to reach, exactly who they are, what their challenges are, what their pains are, what their struggles are, what they hope for, you define that, and that starts to tell you what kind of a show you want to create. That starts telling you the topics you will want to address throughout the podcast. And every piece of content, everything you make, you run through that. It's like, is that something Jim is going to listen to? Is that something that individual is going to consume? Now, you're going to pick up other types of people along the way, but start with that one person. Start thinking through that avatar, that specific individual. You'll start understanding what kind of a show that person will listen to, what will keep them coming back week after week after week, and it's going to give you more information. So that's the place to start. Start with the why, start with the who. Really well define that. Don't spend 5 minutes thinking about it. Really spend some time, come back to it over and over again over a day or two. Really think about it. What are all the reasons? Think about not just the one why you're doing it. Think about the 5. Think about all the reasons Jim might want to listen to it over time. So once you've defined that, once you spend a lot of time understanding the why somebody is going to listen, then you can start to get into the fun parts. You can start thinking of the concept. Okay, now I know who and why, so what type of a show do I want? Is this going to be an interview format? Am I going to be helping them with something, or am I going to be providing content? Am I going to be entertaining? Is this a comedy podcast? Is this a true crime podcast? Even though there's like a bazillion of those, please don't get into true crime podcasts. So you start thinking about that. Then you start going, okay, what's my themes? What's my topics? Maybe you think of a show title. This stuff, that part of the preparation is all pretty easy, but bounce it off people people you trust. You say, hey, if this was a podcast, you probably know the Jim you're speaking to. So go ask him, like, hey, if I made a show like this, would this be something you'd be interested in? Would you listen to it? Bounce the ideas for the title off of someone. Is it catchy? Is it simple? That's something to consider when you're doing your title. You want it to be something that's easy to remember, easy to spell. If it's super long or convoluted or there's a weird word in it, then it might get lost in translation. So the title is important. You kind of want to have at least something a little catchy to remember with that, but I wouldn't overthink it. And then finally, think about your schedule. You will probably revisit the idea of the schedule as you go through the rest of the preparation, but be thinking about how frequently I'm going to put out a show. Am I really going to try and do a weekly show? Is it going to be every other week, or I'm going to put one out on the 5th of every month? How are you going to structure it? Because you want it to be something you can sustain over time. what I see a lot of times is, you go look at the graveyard of dead podcasts, and they start for like weekly podcasts, and they go 1, 2, 3. They hit a roadblock. There's nothing for a month. Then there's 2 more episodes weekly, and then it's dead. It's gone, right? It's disappeared. They could not sustain the pace of a weekly podcast, and they would have been better off doing like, I'm going to do it every other week. I'm going to do it once a month. You can always increase the pace if you find, people are really enjoying this. I like it. I've got my process down. Now I'm going to go to weekly. It's easy to communicate that, but having a regular schedule is so important because your listeners come to expect that. I do a podcast for the Wichita Chamber of Commerce. I think Ricky Ellison was here yesterday. Is that right? So I do their podcast. We do it weekly. Everybody knows at 3 a.m. on a Wednesday morning, the new episode is going to drop. It's always going to come out at that time. So if they subscribe, they know they can expect it. So everything has to revolve around that schedule, making sure we're prepared for that. So think through the schedule. That's where a lot of people get tripped up. Then you need to identify your first 50 podcast topics. If you're going to think through this, you need to know how you're going to do it for a year, right? We don't want to just have a show, unless you've got something very specific like a mini series. You're going to do it for 10, 12 episodes and then it's done. You're never going to touch it again, which is fine. But I'm thinking long-term, like you're going to want to do this over and over. You need to be able to come up with enough ideas that it's going to get you through that first year. So if you're doing it every other week, maybe you only need 25, but have those topics. Doesn't mean you need to do all of those topics as an episode, but you need to show that, hey, I've got enough ideas. There's enough things coming to me. This can branch out enough directions that as I get into it, 20, 30 episodes, I'm going to start seeing new trends and new themes and new ideas that I can explore. So you want to give yourself at least enough material. It's like, I can go back to that list. I don't know what I'm going to talk about. I go back to that list and I pull something. I say, that's what it's going to be. Now, if you're going to do an interview podcast, think about what guests you're going to invite. Think of the 25 or the 50 people you would invite. So it's a little easier in that you don't have to come up with the topics, but you need to be thinking about who it would be that you would invite onto the show. And then finally, you need to prep the first 12 episodes. So start doing those outlines. I recommend not scripting much other than maybe an intro and outro that's always going to be the same. But take your time, do an outline, give yourself the topics, the themes, the talking points you would want to address on the first 12. Because then you know before you ever hit record on a microphone, you've got enough material to get started. You know, okay, I can get into this, I can get rolling as I figure things out. You're not, doing an episode and then going, I have nothing else. There is nothing else to go with after this. I don't know what's going to happen next. You start to get into writer's block. Now, you might get those 12, and then as you start going, you're like, I've got a better idea. Do that episode. There's nothing wrong with that. But you want to give yourself a little bit of a backlog to work from so you don't get stuck on the schedule later on. So then that's the preparation side. That's getting ready for the podcast. That's doing all those pieces. Then you run into the potential pitfalls of the production side. Now, as I mentioned earlier, people get into it, they start recording before they're ready. So we've talked about, thought of all the topic ideas, you've outlined your first episodes. I recommend you record your first 3 to 5 episodes before you ever distribute anything. The reason for this is not because there's 2 reasons really. The first is you need to kind of understand your production process. Find the challenges of using the technology, using the microphones, figuring out how editing works. You don't want to be under the gun trying to release an episode while you don't have that piece. The next part is that now you've got a backlog. We talked about the person that goes 3 weeks and then stops. Life happens. You don't know what's going to come up. You might find a week just chaos reigns and you're not going to be able to do the recording or the episode. Technology fails you. An interview guest flakes out on you. If you have a backlog of episodes, you go, well, let me just pull that one from the backlog, put it in, and I'll catch up next week when I've got more time, right? You've worked ahead a little bit. You've prepared in advance. You know that something's out there. The content is ready to go if you need to grab it. And then you're going to be much less likely to fall into those traps. So make sure you've structured your schedule out first to be repeatable, but then build that backlog. I'm going to give you some things that you will probably need when you're doing a podcast and the free options to do them. The benefit, of doing a podcast is it really is the barrier of entry is low. But the first thing I'm going to say is you do need to spend some money on a USB microphone and a desk-mounted stand. You can use your phone. Do not use your phone. Okay? The number one reason why somebody goes, I just didn't listen to that, is the audio quality was poor. If there's a distraction between you and the listener, they're not going to keep coming back. They're just going to go, I can't think about it. I can't process the information. Your goal and my goal always when I'm creating a show is I want to remove all those possible distractions. So get a nice USB microphone. You don't have to spend a ton of money, but I also don't recommend going and getting the $20 to $40 one on Amazon. Roughly $100. I recommend a couple different ones, $100 or more, depending on how much you want to spend. Blue Yetis are very popular. Rode NT USB is a similar price point, also a very good quality microphone. And if you want to spend a little more money on a USB microphone, the Rode Podcaster is very good. So those are a couple that I recommend. If you find something roughly in that $100 to $150 range, it's probably going to be good. That's the amount of cost that I would expect to get something that's going to be pretty decent with a microphone. But once you've got that, that's basically the only thing you have to pay for. For editing and production software, free options if you're a Mac user, and I see so many Macs around the room today. GarageBand is available. That's all you need. Plug in the USB mic, open GarageBand, boom, you're good to go. If you're a Windows user, Audacity, free software, you can buy it, does simple editing, it's going to get the job done for you. The quality is not going to be quite as good with the free tools. You don't have as much at your disposal as far as the capability. For example, when I do podcasts, I'll do like noise reduction, filtering, I'll do compression, equalization, like I will make it sound like it's Joe Rogan level quality. It's radio quality the whole time when I'm doing it. But to get something that's decent, that's going to be free of distractions, all you need is a simple editor production software like GarageBand or Audacity. Now, when you want to distribute the podcast and get it out into the world, get it on Spotify, get it on Apple Podcasts, you can use some of these tools which have free options. Some of them you can pay a little money, get something more advanced. Anchor is very popular. It actually does some editing, allows you to bring in some music and sound effects. I believe I've never really dove into it too deeply, but I know that a lot of people get started with that one. Spotify probably in the last 2 years bought Anchor because they saw the potential capability there. So it ties in really well with Spotify. Podbean and Buzzsprout are also two popular options for podcasters that have free options available. Now, when you get the show into the distribution channel, that's just giving you your RSS feed. You will still need to go onto Apple Podcasts in many cases and go like connect the RSS feed to those. So you'll have to go subscribe and you'll say, I got to go to Stitcher and go give them my RSS feed so that they pick it up and have it refreshed regularly. But the main ones, I would guess 80-90% of people listening to podcasts are doing it on Apple Podcasts or Spotify. Those are your two major ones. If you get there, awesome. Google Podcasts and Stitcher are also two fairly popular ones that I think if you get on those, you'll pick up some additional audience members periodically, but they're going to be much smaller than your two major players. But those are the ones out there that you can do. There's a lot of other smaller ones beyond that, but I wouldn't necessarily get into those unless you know your audience is there for some reason. And then finally, if you're doing interviews, you can use Zoom. It's free. There's a tool online called Zencastr, which I use when I'm doing remote interviews with somebody. The advantage of a Zencastr over a Zoom is when you use Zoom, you're recording everything on your computer, right? So you're having the conversation. If there's any glitches over the internet, if they drop out for a little bit, you're recording those glitches, you're recording those issues. With the Zencastr, it's actually recording the audio on each person's computer independently. So when it's done, it's uploaded to the cloud. You can download both of those audio files, and then you can edit them in your GarageBand together, stacked as two separate files. And then it's going to be the quality from each individual computer, not something that's come through the internet. There's another one, which is a paid service called Riverside, which I'll get into here in a minute. So those are the free options. If you want something that's maybe, you want to get something a little higher quality than that, there's some paid tools you can use to optimize your work. With the editing production software, I use Pro Tools. Adobe Audition is very popular. Descript is an interesting one that you can get, which you can play with. I think they've got like a trial period if you want to go test it out. But it actually does transcript. So you can record directly into it, and it does the transcript of the show while you're talking. And then you can edit the document. So you can be like, I'm going to remove these words, and it'll automatically remove them from the audio. If you say all the time, repeatedly, you can have it automatically remove those from the audio. I do caution a little bit against just straight taking all of that filler word stuff out, because it's natural, it's conversational. If you take all that stuff out, it actually starts to feel a little bit weird because you're used to hearing somebody talk that way. And that's part of the advantage of a podcast. It kind of creates that human connection, that speaking that you're getting with everybody else. You don't necessarily get the pure polished, this was a YouTube video thing. You're generating a human relationship with somebody. So leaving some of that stuff in is totally fine. It's more important to cut out gaps, or like I needed to rephrase that or say it differently. But Descript is an interesting tool. I use it purely for the transcription portion, but it is one that you can actually use for editing, and has some of those tools as well. For distribution, transistor.fm is the one I use. It gives me a little better analytics than some of the other free tools. I also, with Transistor, can do as many shows as I want. So that's for somebody who does a lot of different podcasts, and I'm constantly going back and managing them all. Having it in one place is nice for me. But that's a good option if you start to go, I want to get bigger, want to get more details on things. I would recommend Transistor. And then interviewing, so Zencastr has a paid option. Riverside.fm is a similar competitor where you're recording on each computer. And then if you're doing their paid options, instead of getting like an MP3 of the recording, you're actually getting a WAV file. And they will record video as well. So if you turn your podcast into, say, a video podcast down the road, or you want to take a video clip for YouTube, this would be a potential option for that. But the secret sauce in production when you're doing your podcast is batching. That is doing all of your tasks together, bundling them. So when I mentioned I do the Wichita Chamber of Commerce's podcast, I am doing all of the recording in one day. One day a month we get together, we record 5 episodes all the same day. It's all done one day. All we are thinking about is recording, capturing audio. That is 100% of our focus. After that, we move on to editing the podcast. That is 100% of the focus. Nothing else is happening. Then it's doing transcription. Then it's doing show notes. Then it's doing the other pieces. I'm putting it all together because if you batch things, you actually start to gain efficiency because you're taking less time. You're in the right flow state to be able to get them all done quickly. You're going to jump straight from one thing to the other instead of trying to do one show beginning to end and kind of jumping from task to task. Now, this only works for a show where you've kind of got that built into your schedule. If you've got something that's time sensitive, I produce the Talk Angry podcast where we talk about Wichita State basketball. You kind of have to be done the same day you record. So you don't have that option. If it's news-based or time-based, you kind of have to just focus on your process, how you get that as efficient as possible so you can get through it quickly. I can do that podcast, including the recording time, in roughly 2 hours. So that's including generating the show notes, the transcript, the editing, the production, the release, and then the time to record it is roughly 30, 45 minutes. So I do it all in one swoop because I've kind of got my process defined. So, but if it's something that's going to be evergreen, that somebody's going to want to go back to and listen to later, that's the benefit of a podcast. They go listen to one episode, they really like it, and they go, hey, there's 20 more. Boom, you've got a new listener. They're going to go listen to everything. If it's something time-based, there's not necessarily the drive to go back because everything is old, it's outdated by that point. Now, you may get some of that. They may go back a week or two because it might be interesting, but that's something to consider when you're thinking about your show. How evergreen is it, or is it really time sensitive? But batching is highly effective. So as far as production, those are the things that I recommend. And then promotion, a lot of people think, oh, I've got this idea. It's a great podcast. It's going to be fantastic quality. If I build it, people are just going to appear out of the Iowa cornfields and enjoy my podcast. And that is not true. You have to go where they are. You have to present the information as something that they can find, they can consume. So you have to go where your audience is at. Now, you don't have to spend money to do this, but it will be somewhat time consuming. So the first thing is start with your personal network. If you are speaking to something, like I mentioned earlier, you've got your avatar, you probably know some people like that in your personal circle, in your personal network. Share it with all of those people. Even if it's somebody that wouldn't themselves be interested, they may know somebody. So start with your personal network. Think about all those people, personally reach out to them, say, hey, I'm starting this podcast. I just released it. We're 1 episode in, going to be doing it weekly, going to be doing it every other week. I'd love for you to listen and give me your feedback. Leave me a review. It'd mean a lot. So your personal network is your best spot to get reviews for your podcast initially. So think about your personal network, those people you have connections with initially that would enjoy the show, that would listen to it. So connect with them first. Then it's online engagement. Now, this does not mean create a Instagram profile, create a TikTok, and then just start throwing things at your own account. When I say online engagement, I mean you need to go to the people. You've got your avatar. You've thought through who that person is. Go find that person on TikTok and engage with their content. Go find that person on Instagram. Go find that person in a Facebook group. Go find those people where they are already at and start engaging with them there. Because if you start, just spend 15 minutes, you go poke around for a little bit, leave some comments, follow some people, they're going to see your name. They're going to click your profile. They're going to go, oh, he has a podcast. She has a podcast. That looks really interesting. I'm going to go check that out. Go to where they are at. Don't expect them to come find you on your social media channel. Now, you still should generate some of that content, but that's not how you're going to get the audience. You're going to have to go out and engage them directly. And finally, in the show itself, you always need to give them a call to action. You always need to give the listener something to do. I often recommend, hey, please, if you've enjoyed the show, leave me a review. If you've already done that, thank you. Please recommend this to someone you think who would enjoy it, who would like it. Just one person. Make it a super low barrier. Make it really, that's the nice thing about podcasts. They're pretty easy to hit the share button and put it out wherever you want. Just ask them to recommend it to somebody. That's something you should always have in every episode of a podcast. That's how you start engaging. And like I said, when you start the podcast, the audience is going to be small, a couple dozen people. That's going to be it. But as you start to build that following, you get that backlog, you get 20 episodes in, and like I mentioned, somebody finds it, they're going to go listen to everything else. You're going to start getting spikes because new people are finding you and they're enjoying the content and they're going to keep coming back and they're going to keep listening to those shows as long as you focus on that avatar. So you need to go find the audience. They're not automatically going to come to you. And eventually that snowball kind of builds itself, right? I've been doing the Talk Angry podcast for 4 or 5 years. We do zero marketing, but just out of longevity in the fan base, we'll get 1,000 downloads a month easy. It won't be difficult during the season to get there. And that's just the time and getting that snowball in place. And it's amazing how that happens. So, that was essentially what I did. I talked a lot about the pain points. That's how I started my business. I said, a lot of people want to start podcasts. They don't want to deal with all that pain, all that struggle. So, that's kind of what I did. I said, I'm going to take care of everything. I'm going to do the podcast development. I'm going to do the recording, the music licensing, voiceover, all those pieces that somebody doesn't want to mess with so they can focus on their content. So that's kind of how I created my business and what I've focused on. So with that, we do have time for some questions. I don't know. You want to moderate or?
Yeah, I'm going to take a mic around for the live stream.
Oh, gotcha. Okay. So we can talk about anything we talked about here. You can feel free to ask me any other questions about podcasting that maybe we didn't address. I will go wherever you are interested.
Perfect. I have one question for y'all to start off, and I failed to mention this in my bio. Would anyone guess that this is not Bryan's day job? Anybody guess that? Yeah, Bryan's an engineer at Textron Aviation by day, by the way. I failed to mention that in the intro, so this is definitely something he's built out of a passion and also operates a recording studio on the side, so a music recording studio. I don't think I mentioned that either. So
I'm busy.
Hearing
That's
him,
what.
yes, he's busy. Hearing him speak, I would never guess that he did not do this full time. So I'm going to come around for some questions. Do y'all have questions?
I'm curious, how many of you have started a podcast before? Anybody? How many want to start a podcast? Would like to start a podcast? Okay. How many of you are here for like extra credit? I'm just checking. That's okay. That's okay. Like I said, it's okay on your why to be totally narcissistic. It's totally okay. So
We
questions.
also, and Jessica can help you out with more information. We have some podcasting studios and equipment over in Elliott Hall. If you need some barrier to entry spaces and tools to play with and recording gear and stuff, a great place to test some things out in some of our classes. So I'll make a short plug for some communication classes. So, okay, question. I'm gonna come around to you, and we are live streaming, so I'm gonna bring a mic around just so our audience at home can hear you. Go ahead.
We've got questions online too. If we can take them there.
Is it my understanding that you are available for retainment to do podcasts
Yes.
for individuals?
Mhm.
Okay. What is a tentative average cost of retaining your services?
So typically it's a per episode cost, and it kind of depends on how long. So are we doing like 3 months? It's based on the number of episodes that we book. So it can be $200 to $350 if we're doing like video content, things like that go along with it. But the basic simple podcast, would be $200, and it includes, like I mentioned before, if that works, all of those things and some more. So taking care of all that.
Do you ever do podcasts for motivational speakers?
I do one right now for a life coach and counselor. I have not done one for a motivational speaker, but I imagine somebody who's wanting to build an audience for something like that, it would be valuable because you're trying to get that following, getting those people to engage. So yeah, I totally see the appeal for a motivational speaker.
Awesome. Other questions for Bryan? Yes, one back here.
Do you have any recommendations for people that are just now getting started on podcasts, like more specifically than the ones you mentioned in your...
I'm sorry, like the ice machine went right as you were asking your question.
Okay. Is there like any advice or specific like classes that you advise people to take while they start their podcast?
Honestly, podcasting is such a new and constantly changing format that there's really not a lot of classes on that. The thing I would recommend is get that software on your computer, like an Audacity or a GarageBand, and you can just use your embedded mic in your laptop and just be like, okay, if I talk and record, this is what it does. Here's how I would edit or cut out clips. And you can easily do a Google search for some stuff like that. Find stuff on YouTube. YouTube would be really useful. It's like, how do I edit audio in Audacity? Very, very basic stuff. You can just watch some 5-minute YouTube videos and get some ideas on that. But I would, like Eric mentioned, there's some studios here on campus. They've got some microphones and little mixers, and you can go test and just play for an hour and just try and figure out how it works, and get some ideas with that. So biggest tip that I have is don't clip. Leave yourself plenty of headroom. Don't saturate the mic. If you see the red light, stop. Not the recording light, the red light on the meter. That means you're going too hot. So
nothing annoys me more when I'm listening to a podcast than hearing the mouse clicks while they're in emails coming in. So, yeah. Question over here. What do you got?
So, do you suggest to have those things in mind that you presented today before hiring outward and asking for help?
No, if somebody is hiring out for help on a podcast, you don't necessarily need to have that. Now, if you want to take on some of the stuff yourself, you might just say, hey, I want to go find somebody who can just edit my podcast. I don't want to mess with the editing production. I can do everything else. I can record myself. Then you might be able to just go, I'm going to search for a podcast editor online, but find somebody. Then you need still the microphone, for example. I still think that would be useful, especially if you're going to do like an online interview or something like that. So.
How many people do you recommend, like regular people, having on a podcast? Like regular.
Oh, as far as the number of people on the mic?
Yes.
So no more than 3.
No more than 3.
There's times where it's been 4. The reason why is there's too many cooks in the kitchen. If you get too many voices, it's hard to keep track of who's who when all you've got is audio to go with. So sometimes maybe a host doesn't want to do it by themselves. They're like, I want somebody else to kind of talk with. So you might have a co-host situation.
That was the word I was thinking.
Yeah, you get a co-hosted situation. So I guess this is a good maybe segue to talk about the different formats. So you can do a co-hosted podcast where 2 of you are just bantering. It's the same 2 people every time. You can do the interview podcast where it's a host interviewing a guest or 2. You can set those up like we mentioned on Zoom or in person if you've got more than one microphone and a small mixer like they've got back there. You can do a monologue where it's just an individual. It could be a motivational speaker. It could be a coach of some sort talking about topics that are trying to educate or inform an audience. So it'd be something like that. And then there's other entertainment styles. But those are the main ones that people use. The ones that take a lot of time are if you listen to Freakonomics, for example, is a highly edited, produced podcast. They go do multiple interviews with multiple people, and it's like doing Dateline for podcasting because they're picking up all these different pieces and trying to craft a story. Those things can take a month to put together. To get all the content. So I don't necessarily, for somebody starting out, recommend doing something like that just because it is a lot of work to get something like that going. But that is another format that's out there.
Bryan, I have a question for you. You mentioned that you have a handful of things that you listen to. What are some of your favorite podcasts? What are you listening to right now?
I listen to Freakonomics. I listen to Office Ladies, which is behind the scenes of The Office. So you can, if you can't tell, I'm a huge fan of that show. Let's see. I listen to Grow the Show, which is actually talking about growing podcast audiences. I listen to The Art of Manliness. This feels like looking in somebody's diary a little bit. So, but those are some of the ones that I enjoy. Rogue Creators is a good one for marketing, since this is a communications group. Rogue Creators, and they're offline right now because they're rebranding, coming out with a new podcast. I don't know what it's going to be. And then Labeled, which talks about Tooth and Nail Records and the music scene of basically the late 90s through the mid 2000s. So those are very wide variety. They actually say I didn't show the statistic, but the average regular podcast listener listens to 7 different shows. You're not necessarily trying to get a listener away from what they're already consuming, because odds are if it's something valuable, they'll find the space in their life to do it. I'm listening to podcasts when I'm driving, when I'm mowing the grass. There's tons of space for it, and that's an advantage it has over, say, a YouTube channel or a blog, which requires your attention. You can't be doing something else at the same time. So some of those mundane tasks that don't require your brain really to focus on, you can really listen to podcasts and gain the content that way. So that is an advantage that podcasts have over other content marketing strategies and things like that. So, yeah.
Question from Ian.
Go for the students.
Okay.
Yeah.
You said not to do a true crime podcast. Is there any type of podcast you do recommend that someone tries to go into?
Whatever you're passionate about. I mean, if it's, because the thing to consider is, if you are excited about it and want to spend time doing it, it's going to be easier to stay on top of it and do it. Some people, I will say, make it as targeted as possible. So when we talked about gym, make it as specific to a gym as possible. Make it really specific. You might go, oh, that's too narrow. People aren't going to listen to that. But the more narrow you get, you actually get more buy-in, more attention, more devotion from those listeners. And like we said, we're starting with a couple dozen people. If you are really focusing on specific pain points of a specific type of person or something they are specifically interested in, they're going to tell all of the people that are exactly like them about it. And that's what you want to get. So whatever you're passionate about, I don't know that there's any one. Like, you listen to my list, it's very all over the place, whatever I'm interested in. So find something you're interested in, excited about, and focus on that. And that's where some of the preparation will help. If you can think through all the topics, okay, I've got this idea, this podcast concept has legs to it. I could do this for a long period of time. So,
Questions?
All
right, let's go to Ian.
Well, I was wondering about advertising. How do you facilitate? Do you work with that in podcasts, and how recommendations for people just starting out about whether they want to include advertising? Also, what's the research about the effectiveness of ads on podcasts?
So I'm trying to remember. I believe 60% of podcast listeners who have bought something that they've heard about on a podcast. Most people do not skip through the ads on a podcast. They tend to listen to them. There's a much higher throughput rate, at least in the research that I've done. And the average income for a podcast listener is generally higher than some of the other forms of media. So there are people with more disposable income. That's at least what the research says. I honestly, now the Chamber of Commerce podcast, we do advertising for it because it is a sponsored branded podcast, and they have facilitated that directly. What I have done is enable them to be able to dynamically insert whatever advertising they sell, right? So we can say for these shows, they can sell for this show specifically, we're going to put an ad in that's always going to be there, or we have the ability to dynamically insert it where I'm going to advertise on all of your episodes for a month, right? So I think we're up to 50 episodes have released now, or close to it. And I could put an ad on all of them, but that ad would only appear for the 1 month, for example. So there's a couple different ways. Advertising in podcasts is constantly changing. You can always add advertising later if you start to get the listeners, because it's hard to get one up front when you have no audience yet. But as you grow that audience, say, hey, some people might express interest in sponsoring it or having an ad that would play during the podcast. And most people are pretty used to it. You can have anywhere from 3 to 4 ads, a couple in the beginning and a couple in the middle. Nobody really bats an eye because it's a minute here, a minute there. So that's more than that. Don't put ads at the end. Nobody listens at the end. Whoever's paying for an ad will not be very happy about that. So don't put ads at the end. even though it's an option. So,
Brian, we have a question from our live stream audience.
Yes, so I will read it. This is from Madeline McCullough, and it says, there's the 7 deadly sins of radio. So besides not going into true crime podcasting, what are the top things to avoid?
oh,
It's a good one.
I think a lot of what we talked about today are the things to avoid. Don't over edit. I think I mentioned that before. So a lot of people can get stuck in editing for hours and hours. Now, when you get started, it may take you an hour or two to do the first couple of episodes. But as you kind of get familiar with it, know what to look for, all you really want to do in editing is remove things that you really don't want in there, remove dead spaces, clean up transitions, things like that. Don't go into it surgically removing every filler word, because that's not going to be helpful. That's not going to be something that people will feel natural about. It's going to be awkward. So don't over edit. Make sure that it's a schedule you can keep and follow. Other things not to do. I'm trying to think what not to do. 7 deadly sins of podcasting. I kind of want to think about that more. A lot of what we talked about today is what people get stuck on, but I don't know that there's a whole lot that's deadly.
Come back to Comm Week 2022 for Brian's follow-up
Yeah,
session.
seven deadly sins of podcasting. I'll work on that. That's good.
Hannah,
That's
did you have a question?
Oh, yeah.
So my question is about like content in the podcasting, because you could like have it really be amazing audio, but if you're just saying dumb stuff, like it might not be successful. So do you have any tips about how to come up with good content and maybe some faux pas of like creating bad content to avoid?
Well, I mean, so maybe the way to frame it is when somebody listens to the podcast, they're going to be changed in some way. Even somebody who's they hate their Monday morning commute, they don't like going to work. Well, maybe you create a comedy podcast that comes out on Monday mornings, and they're transformed because now on Monday morning, they have something to look forward to on their drive to work. So their life is transformed in some way. So I think every podcast, the goal is to give your audience some form of transformation. Can be small, doesn't have to be magnificent or huge, but you think about Jim, okay, how am I going to transform Jim? And what are the things that can transform him? They can be, making something he's really good at. So he could make it be stronger at it. It might be something that's a pain to start removing that pain from his life for one reason or another. So like think about, as far as the content to make people come back, they're going to want to see some transformation. Something about their life is changing for the better. And if you frame your content in that way, I think that it would be something that's valuable. It's going to keep people coming back, and you're going to keep making good content that way. Does that help?
I almost describe podcasts as like a kind of the magazines for the current generation. I mean, there's a niche for everything, and probably a higher level of engagement than a magazine, obviously, because you've got audio and sometimes video. But that's in my nerdy way, I describe them as kind of the magazines for the 2020s, I guess. So we have time for probably one more question, then we'll wrap it up. Anything else? Okay. Well, Brian, thank you so much for being here.
Appreciate it.
Thank you to everyone who joined us.
I will say, if you want to contact me and talk later, you've got more questions, I've got business cards or something, you can reach out to me on my email address. Is my email up here? Boom, email address. If you want to reach out to me, feel free. If you want to talk more beyond this, or you got some ideas or something comes up later and you think about it later, feel free to reach out. So.
Brian, thank you again for being here. Our next session starts at 11, so you're welcome to hang out. You're welcome to come and go. But thank you again for getting us off to a great start, and good to see everybody. We'll see you again about 11 o'clock for session number 2.